Welcome, everybody, to the next interview in our speaker series that is part of the Leadership Education and Development series. This is a new free online learning community as we all continue on our journeys of being more expert leaders. The theme for this speaker series is Thriving in the New Normal, What Leaders Should Know to Confidently Lead Innovation in Hybrid and Remote Teams and Organizations. If you haven't already found the other speakers in the series, follow the link that's in the description around this video. And when you register, you will get all of the interviews, and it's over a dozen now, into your inbox, including the speakers' thank you gifts, resources, bonuses. You will also get an invite to the Facebook group. We have over 200 people now in the Facebook group that's designed to allow us to engage with each other, discuss the speaker interviews, but also share people's own experience as we are adjusting to this new normal of leading innovation in hybrid and remote teams. The speakers all focus on a different aspect of this question. Some focus more on what is innovation, some focus more on hybrid and remote teams, many focus on tips and tools and strategies for how to run meetings, how to have iterative approaches. We also have leadership coaches that focus on your own individual growth as a leader. This particular interview I'm really excited about because we have a faculty member in the School of Strategic Leadership Studies, where I am pursuing my own doctorate now. And he focuses with his colleagues on how we develop the innovative or innovation capacity of young adults that are in college. So what does it actually take to be innovative or contribute to innovation processes? He's really going to help parse these definitions. He is Dr. Benjamin Selznick. Ben, as most people refer to him. You can find him on Twitter at Ben Selznick. Dr. Selznick studies how colleges and universities can develop student innovators and the conditions that support such development. He also engages scholarship on leadership in complex learning organizations. Might ask you about that. That sounds really interesting. College student experiences and the uses of contemporary methodologies. He has his PhD in higher and post-secondary education from New York University, also his master's in higher education and student affairs from NYU, a bachelor's in religion from Dartmouth. His research interests are higher education leadership, innovation, applied learning, college student experiences, and mixed methods research. Dr. Selznick, what else would you like to say to introduce you as we get started?
I think you just about covered it there.
Okay.
But I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, really happy to be here. Just to frame folks, that's what good faculty members do. Are we talking about innovation as an outcome, like innovative things, products, services? What are you particularly focused on here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll get to it a bit more in the presentation, but to lead it off, I think innovation is one of those words that it's like after you've chewed gum for long enough, it just becomes stale, right? And so it's a term that kind of means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And so you can either take that and say, well, innovation doesn't mean anything, or as I think is part of the goal of this series, right? You can try to think about, well, what does it mean? In what context can we use it? And how can we maybe further operationalize the idea of innovation so that it becomes something that can actually be more commonly understood and ultimately better used. I think about innovation, it certainly can be an outcome, but when I think about it more as a process, so innovation can lead to outcomes, but oftentimes, even if we say, well, we want the innovative thing, everyone wants that, right? Where I think folks who might be watching this are more interested in is, well, how do we get there? And how do we provide leadership that gets us, whatever the us is in this situation? How do we provide leadership that gets us to that thing, to gets us to that point, right? And I think that's why innovation more as a process that can lead to an outcome versus just discussing it as an outcome.
Well, I have so many questions, but let's start with where we're going to start, which is a presentation that you prepared, and then I will ask my questions as we get into it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay. So again, Dr. Ben Selznick, Unpacking Innovation for Hybrid Remote Team Leadership, which is a broad concept that fits into what we're talking about here today, both today and in this series. And Kai, feel free to, interrupt and ask as you'd like to. So let's start by defining innovation as we define it, right? This is not innovation as everybody defines it, of course. So work led by me and Dr. Matt Mayhew at The Ohio State University and colleagues, right? In our work, and our work is focused primarily on college students, as well as higher education organizations, colleges, universities, the like. We've defined innovation, right, as the process of generating and executing contextually beneficial new ideas. And I'll add that arriving at that definition was the product of much reading, conversation, back and forth, asking experts. A lot went into that. So even, understanding, defining innovation as a challenge, this didn't just roll off the tongue. Let's leave it at that. And so let's briefly talk through what I mean here. I mean, first, as I just mentioned, right, this idea of innovation as process, I think that's a pretty important construct. And the nice part, as I'll kind of get to a little bit later, the nice part about innovation as process is that processes that maybe worked in not hybrid remote environments, that worked in more in-person everyday team environments, they can be adjusted, adapted, they can be changed, right? If the outcome of innovation is solely tied to one process and that process changes, right, that presents some distinctive challenges. But if we see innovation as a process, that by definition makes it maybe a bit more adaptable and flexible. So let's briefly talk this through. So generating, right? Generating is really that ideation phase, that coming up with new ideas, right? We might think of it as processes of brainstorming, and maybe brainstorming plus, right? Brainstorming with some kind of attachment toward next steps. And so our work, we draw on the efforts of Scott Shane, kind of a well-known scholar in the field of entrepreneurship management, who kind of thinks about a multi-step process that kind of starts with, coming up with the idea and ends with doing the thing. So generating is that important part of the innovation process. And that's certainly, to your question, Kai, of like process outcome, generating speaks more to the full-on, the earlier phases of what we commonly refer to as innovation. And then we kind of get to executing, right? So, and it's important here to understand that this process involves both coming up and doing it, right? So a key part of innovation, at least as we define it, is that you can't just brainstorm all day. I mean, think of all the like amazing ideas you've had for products, services while like driving in your car or walking your dog or whatever, right? Like how many of those have you actually taken and done something with, right? And that's fine. It's not, I do that all the time as well. I think, but to really kind of get into the innovation space, it does have to have that generation and execution. So this process in some way, Kai, like almost includes at least some semblance of an outcome, or at least proceeding toward whatever that outcome.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Stanford Research Institute, SRI, which is out in California, their global headquarters has a center of excellence, biotech center of excellence here in Harrisonburg, Rockingham County, and they're seen as one of the most innovative companies in the world. Came up with the mouse and HD TV, and they're all kinds of interesting technology products. They define innovation as they frame it as a new idea that provides value that can be brought to market. Right. I'm paraphrasing, but basically their execution isn't doing it just in the actions, but actually the business model that's attached to it, the whole process attached to it being implemented. So I'm just reminded of that definition in this one.
Yeah, and absolutely. And maybe just an important kind of insight into, again, the process that led to this. Predecessor research did focus on innovative entrepreneurship, right? So how can college develop innovative entrepreneurs? And so there was that kind of very more direct sense of, the outcome was like creating a new business, product, process, something along those lines. And as we further engage the work, and I kind of started engaging the problem a bit more with Dr. Mayhew, we really did think, what about something broader, a broader approach to innovation, right? That would, really not would include, right, and importantly, would include value creation, more traditional forms of entrepreneurship, but might also include anything from a student starting a club or a public service. We talk about like students who start tutoring groups for students in the community, for younger students in the community, right? That can be innovative too in a certain regard. So we also wanted to encompass broader perspectives on innovation. And interestingly enough, I think as the term and the concept and even in what you're talking about has evolved, innovation is certainly used in a business context, but it's used in a lot of other contexts as well. So one thing I do here at JMU, along with Kai, is serve as an entrepreneurship faculty fellow, where we work with the Entrepreneurship Center on their messaging and outreach and framing. And many of those conversations have been, how do we expand concepts of innovation, expand concepts of entrepreneurship to include all types of students, not just business students. So it's a part of the dialogue, and it was something we actively sought to include in our approach to studying innovation.
Thank you for setting the definition early on, as I would have only expected.
So to finish it out, right, then we talk about contextually beneficial. And that's kind of, to the Stanford one, that's kind of, in our view, a more expansive presentation of this like value creation, something great, something that meets a niche or something like that, right? Is we think about it more like it has to benefit some context. So this is also kind of what separates innovation in our work, in our world, from just like radical ideas that are maladaptive or antisocial or kind of just don't do much good, right? And so we do kind of see this framing as it's got to benefit some context, right? And that's not wildly dissimilar from other presentations of innovation. But it is something that kind of allows us to include the student with the new product in the engineering lab, as well as the student who wants to develop the tutoring program. We just heard something recently about students at JMU that developed like a lacrosse program for like middle and high schoolers, right? Like that is because there wasn't one, and they saw there could be a great opportunity to work with students to teach them how to play lacrosse and enjoy the game and get outside and do fun things. That contextual benefit and the new widget contextual benefit are both part of the same conversation in our presentation of innovation. So to move on, right, because my background is in higher education, and I've taken a very kind of human development approach through that work. Kai's been in class with me, so he knows that as well. But we kind of had to think about, okay, so if innovation is something that can be developed, right, what are these capacities that we might be able to develop in college students? And I've also talked about this in other organizations, and I'll comment on this later, amongst really any kind of group that's looking to do innovative stuff, right? What are some of the attributes or capacities that could be developed? And so just to really quickly frame this, right, it's kind of capacities is something inherently, and as we researched it, these are all things, I'll talk about them briefly. These are all attributes of individuals that theoretically, and we've seen quantitatively like proof in this, can be developed. So we think about like personality traits, right? Trait theory would suggest that personality traits are fixed, right? They may, you might be shy sometimes, but you're kind of more introverted or you're more extroverted. It's hard really to develop someone as an extrovert. You can develop skills that appear as extroversion, right? But developing as an extrovert is kind of more difficult. These are all areas that can be developed. And so we draw on kind of Keegan's broader human developmental framework that says basically humans develop along three kind of interrelated lines: our intrapersonal, which is kind of our sense of self and who we are, and internal things, our social, our relationship with others, and cognitive is basically how we translate what we know into what we do, is the three kind of lines of development there. And so on the intrapersonal side, we thought about motivation, and this all comes from a lot of research and literature in primarily two spheres, mainly entrepreneurship education, because entrepreneurship education has thought a lot about this along the Stanford definition. So how do we use college to develop these things to get that definition achieved, basically, right? As well as just kind of broader higher education work, human development work, teaching and learning work, that kind of sphere of how we educate people. Okay, so we have kind of motivation, and what we saw was important was intrinsic motivation. So the ability to stay motivated toward maybe longer term goals, or maybe even motivated toward goals that are like unrealizable or way distant, right? So not extrinsic motivation where, cue reward. It's more motivation that's intrinsic. Proactivity, right? That's very important, being able to not just be reactive, but proactive. And then kind of innovation self-concept. Do you see yourself as somebody who can engage that process of generating and executing contextually beneficial new ideas? On the social side, we kind of found support for ideas of networking. And networking broadly defined, but can you introduce yourself to people? Can you make new connections? Can you sustain connections? Persuasive communication is a big one. Any innovation course anywhere probably has elements of that. Can you convince other people that your idea or process or product or whatever is the right one, is a good one, is a profound one? Teamwork across forms of difference. So, and this kind of gets at what we're talking a bit about today, but can you work with others who are different from you in whether by way of gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, culture, nation? I mean, you could think of any kind of form of difference, but that was important, especially amongst college students, because oftentimes, classes and co-curricular activities do involve forms of teamwork across difference to achieve something new. And finally, cognitive is like this intention to innovate. I'm not going to go into it, but it's basically like can you go from ideation to creation in some kind of, or do you perceive yourself as able to do that? Risk-taking tolerance is certainly something we saw often, especially in the entrepreneurship side, especially in the venturing side. What is your kind of tolerance to engage risk? And finally, this idea of like creative cognition, broadly in the space of creativity, but part of it is kind of integrative learning or interdisciplinary thinking. Can you kind of think in kind of not just an associative way, like these things are related, but in like I forget the name, what calls bisociative, basically can I think like across different kind of spheres of things and bring multiple concepts together to create something. So that's kind of how we position these capacities. And basically, innovation is that process, and these capacities are what can be developed among people, or presumably people, teams, right, to better engage the process of innovation. So that's kind of the direction our work took us with respect to innovation.
It's really interesting and tracks along many themes from the other speakers in the series. And I want to come back to a distinction we've made a couple times in the other interviews, which is the distinction between leader and leadership development. And if you are an individual watching this, trying to think, what can I do myself to be more innovative myself? That would be one way to interpret this slide, potentially. Another way would be if you are a training director or a CEO and you're trying to enhance the innovativeness of your colleagues, your team, your employees, this would be potentially a slide to reference as like, what could you be developing in individuals? And those would be maybe leader development exercises where you're developing an individual. That's what we're doing with Maureen Metcalf in the Innovative Leadership Program. That's going to be a months-long exploration. What I'm interested in is most of the other interviews have focused on the organizational culture and context where individuals do these things. And so which is, maybe somebody that isn't naturally great at networking, or isn't intrinsically motivated to begin with, or isn't very risk tolerant, could be in a space, in a workplace setting, in a team setting, working for a supervisor, working with colleagues that enable these things. And it makes me think about that. It just gives me a new way to think about why culture, climate matters. It's because maybe they can move people along these capacities if they're not naturally inclined already to be very good at or have these things very well developed. So it's just an observation and thought as I reflect on this slide in the context of all the other interviews.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we did one paper along the way where we actually did look at like a case study of a university that was designed. It was a relatively newer university, this was published in the Journal of College Student Development, and we kind of looked at, so like what are the organizational climates and conditions that kind of promote this among students. And some of it was very deeply cultural. It was like, this is what we do, this is what we want to be as a university, this is who we are. But a lot of it was that, and I haven't seen the other interviews yet, but it was like people across the organization. So in a college and university, we looked at administrators and faculty, staff, and students. So we looked at like the whole presentation. It was like everyone from like the community outreach side to like a second year student to a staff member, like they were all kind of clued in and cued into various aspects of this, right? And tried to think about like, what is and not this directly, they didn't use our thing as a template, but it was like, some of it was like, what can I do to help students really support being in teams across different? So there was like, classes that focused on a lot of interdisciplinary work and kind of community outreach work, right? A lot of it too was like, if a student really was demonstrating like the beginnings of something innovative or interesting, like how could that student be propelled toward continuing that kind of love of learning, that creative development, right? Versus told like, well, that's something you do after college, right? And so it was really just like, it was just kind of creating both like personal level supports, so like staff, faculty, administrators, as well as kind of like organizational supports, like I'm going to take an independent study versus this other required class so I can keep pursuing this idea. That kind of fostered this culture and climate. So we did that once, and it really did check out. We were actually surprised at how closely it checked out. In fact, it was a qualitative study, and our themes for the qualitative study were just like generating, executing, contextually benefit. Like it was just like that definition just became our themes because they were just so readily apparent.
That's really interesting. And I know that I'm pushing the interpretation of this outside of the undergraduate context, but just to put that disclaimer out there, but do you have any comments on this transferring into a workplace setting?
Yeah, from the capacity side, and maybe I'll do the leadership side, then we can try to like fuse them together. But from the capacity side, what we have seen is, first of all, with the intention to innovate construct, that's actually been like validated after the fact in the measure of design of that measure. So in other words, it was like, do people who actually do innovative entrepreneurship, or as we did in that, we haven't done it on this one exactly yet. We pretty much have, but like, do they have these skills at a high level? And the answer is yes. And so that's kind of a part of it from the wonky measurement side. But from the practical side, I mean, a lot of this is drawn from, or maybe just like making into a college climate, things we see in broader studies of management, entrepreneurship, right? Even, I mean, many leadership organizations, and Kai, this speaks to your own research, this form of persuasive communication, right? What does that look like? How is that done? How does that roll out from a leadership standpoint? Like, there's pieces in here, right, that are maybe more directly related, and some are maybe a little bit indirectly related, but there's certainly aspects here that relate well beyond, and we from a college standpoint would hope they relate well beyond, right? What can be done in a learning setting.
Yeah, that's interesting. Since I'm interested in listening, and I think listening is an overlooked aspect of communication. I'm not the only one that thinks that. And in leadership communication, in communication studies itself, and I'm in that social, right there in the middle slide, it says persuasive communication, which could presume for some people to mean speaking, influencing, persuading is usually a speaking action. Negotiations classes would say start with listening, but I guess maybe in that cognitive space, that creative cognition, I don't know what biassociative means, but at some point, isn't there a skill of discerning what you're hearing, discerning what needs are being addressed, and really trying to understand what's being communicated around you in that context and by the people that you're trying to serve, like that. I guess that's a cognitive element, perhaps. Where would something like that show up here?
Yeah, I was thinking, to me, it would be maybe more some kind of aggregation of like all the social stuff. Almost too, interestingly enough, like now that you're pushing me on it, um, you know, this part about like um the intrapersonal, right? Like, so if I'm intrinsically motivated and I want longer term goals, it probably is beneficial to me to spend considerable time listening, right, to others, and engaging listening as a part of my leadership, because maybe this conversation I'm going to learn something new, or I'm going to, help Kai feel like he can achieve things, right? Because I know that like I can, I can command and control in that moment, but that's probably only going to have short-term dividends, right? But if I'm kind of more keeping an eye on longer term, intrinsically motivated, not externally, right? Not extrinsically. So, extrinsically might be like, I need you to like, smile and nod and clap for me. Intrinsic might be more like, I don't, I want us to all smile and clap and nod in 5 years when we sell the company or do the thing or whatever, So I think it's probably an element of that too, because it does take, as you're learning and we've talked about, it does take quite a bit of self-regulation
Yeah.
to be a comprehensive listener, but also these kind of social things, right? To do networking. I mean, like, we've all been at the cocktail party where, someone just will not stop talking, right? And that's tough. It's tough to be like, I really want to connect with this person who, won't stop talking, right? I've found in my own journeys, the best way to network is to ask people questions, right? Like it's, and I think anyone who teaches this stuff, show an interest, talk to people, listen, right? So I think it's kind of those elements as well. But certainly it's in here, and then
Yeah.
persuasive communication, it's like, what's the end goal of the persuasion, right? So like, if, I mean, think about, like, I always think about the movie Inception, right? Like the most persuasive thing I can think of is to have a conversation and I have an idea, and by the end of it, you think it was your idea. Like
Mhm.
that's amazing persuasion, right?
Yeah, that fits the definition. I guess any of these things could be looked at as polarities too. So, if you're very persuasive, an element here is, humility, the idea of being persuaded, the ability to be persuadable, particularly around what you thought your great new idea was to solve this
Mhm.
problem. And if your particular idea is off the mark a little bit, are you open to adjusting it, or are you dug
Absolutely.
in? And that's definitely a theme through the speaker series. So that's interesting.
Yeah, so I'm gonna move on to the next one. I did want to share, I am a professor in leadership, so of course I got to give you some theoretical perspectives, but there's a couple that kind of come to mind here, and I don't have time to go through these all in detail. There's a lot of excellent resources out there on these concepts. And these kind of all, I think, fit into innovation in various ways. An emerging theory that a number of my students are interested in is this idea of adaptive leadership. It comes from Heifetz and others, and it kind of gets this idea that, like, there's challenges we face that are very technical challenges, like problem solution, but a lot of the problems, especially in like more fast-paced kind of high innovation environments, leaders are going to face are more adaptive challenges, where you kind of need to like take the information, make some decisions, keep aware, make some decisions. These kind of problems are adaptive and they're kind of rolling forward. And so I think that's an important idea to kind of get in here. Another one that does speak to more traditional presentations of innovation is this idea of entrepreneurial leadership. That's actually been more developed out as a theory, as a measure, as a way of thinking about that. And that's really leadership in what we'd consider like entrepreneurial environments, especially, small startups and kind of more, entrepreneurial facets of larger organizations and things like that. How do you lead teams to really, identify opportunities and progress that identification towards some form of value creation? And then the final one that I think, when you think about like complex learning organizations that I find persuasive, certainly for higher education, is this idea of shared leadership, right? Leadership as something that can be distributed, as something that's not just wound up in the leader, but in fact in multiple leaders, and can be something that really can take advantage when it works out well, right? Of a lot of the different strengths of a lot of different organizations. So one way also of thinking about these challenges, kind of or about these perspectives back to this, is that maybe you need someone that can do all these things, but maybe you need to find people that can do some of these things really well and team them, so that you can kind of have multiple dimensions, different people to take on different parts of projects, things like that, because maybe that's what's going to drive it towards success, as long as maybe we kind of are thinking more in a shared perspective that different members of the team have kind of different levels of autonomy based on what their roles, functions, what they're trying to achieve are.
If this piques your interest and you're watching, very soon we're going to promo an opportunity to learn about what it's like to be a PhD student in the School of Strategic Leadership Studies, where you could dig into this. So just a short preview there, but these leadership theories are very aligned with the themes that we've seen coming through here. And I'd like to focus in on shared leadership a little bit, because the idea is that a recent undergraduate would be hired likely not as a CEO. Sometimes, of course, certainly some people that are the entrepreneurs that have their business ideas and are doing startups, but the majority are going to join a team, an organization that wants them to contribute to that organization's innovation and processes in the way that you've been describing. So for shared leadership, for a group of people as individuals to combine together to work in an innovative way to lead to innovative outcomes, we need students that have developed these innovation capacities, I would think, to be able to contribute at a high level. So that I guess I'm pointing out that really the team context that I think even your studies take a part in, right? I mean, what students are doing in their undergraduate careers, working on teams, right? They're not leading little, organizations. They're participating together in group processes, or what are they actually doing that's developing their innovative capacities?
Yeah, I mean, we look at it in a lot of different ways. So interestingly enough, well, two things. One, there's studies put out by like AAC&U and other kind of organizations, and so often they find that like 2/3 or more of employers like want students who can be innovative, right? Just for the very reasons you mentioned. And so we've used that in some ways of framing our work as like, yeah, like we're interested in this, but like look at the demand side by way of employers. Like they're really interested in this, for precisely they want folks that have some of those capacities, or maybe elements of all of those capacities, to be part of their teams. And certainly organizations can develop and want to develop specific attributes and knowledge bases and skills. But if you get somebody that can really, go from nothing to something in relatively short time, that can be very valuable along multiple dimensions of value for an organization. To your second point there, one thing we find is pretty interesting is that what is a common driver of growth, and we see this in a paper we'll talk a bit about at the end, but what's a common driver of growth here is when students are able to kind of translate what they're learning in the classroom to kind of life and work and things outside of the classroom, right? In other words, can they apply that knowledge into their lives? And I think that has pretty interesting carryover for how we think about any kind of learning process or leadership process in organizations, where it's like, what are we, and we've talked a bit about, training and development. Like I talked with a student yesterday about it. It's like, well, what are people getting in training and development, that's one question. That's a big, important, interesting question. But then like, how are they being asked to apply that? Like, are they being asked to apply that? Are they being asked to apply it in a very like one-to-one way, or maybe in like a, here's what we did in this training, now go forth and do whatever you're going to do with that, like a one-to-many kind of way? And I think we kind of see often that so much of these processes, so much of these skills are gained, right, when you don't have to just persuasively communicate in a laboratory class type of a controlled environment, but when you have to persuasively communicate in a very unstructured environment, right? And so it's thinking too about, and tying that back to your question, right? It's thinking too about, how our students or anybody kind of in a learning environment, right? How are they being asked to apply these skills, build these capacities, and if it involves leadership in a more kind of direct or in some kind of relational kind of way, right? How are those leadership practices or processes maybe empowering them, as you talked about with culture and organizations, maybe empowering them to kind of flex their muscles a little bit, to kind of be the one that has to go out and keep everybody motivated or something like that.
Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm really thinking about the likelihood that people exhibit those capacities differently in different contexts. And, maybe they're on a sports team and they are being very innovative. They're saying, hey, let's change this play. And they're speaking up and they're challenging a coaching play or something because it's just their element. Or they're helping raise two little kids at home, they're younger siblings, and they had to take on a leadership role and help in a family situation, or just figuring out how to make dinner less stressful, those sorts of things. And I just, it makes me think about the opportunity as individuals to think about, where do we exhibit those capacities in our highest form, and what is it about those contexts and our way of being in those contexts, or what's around us, what supports we have that maybe isn't available in whatever setting we are feeling doubt around, or don't feel like we can exhibit those capacities at as high a rate or consistency or something.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's important that we keep in mind with college students, but it's important kind of for any context, is that, when students come to college, they are not at all a blank slate, like by any means or measure, right? They come from all kinds of trajectories, all kinds of personal experiences, you name it, some student has done it, right? And so what's important to recognize is that people have some of these capacities. I mean, when we do this kind of test of like beginning and end of college, or beginning and, end of the first year or whatever, we survey sample students as close to when they walk in the door as possible. And that's, I mean, for statistical reasons, that helps us get estimates of their development over and above how they came in. But for very practical reasons, right, it also helps give us a sense of how students are coming to college. And so one thing I think it's important too in the leadership space always, and this speaks across all the three theories on the previous slide, is this high recognition that members of your organization, followers, if you want to think of it in that way, they have some of these things to begin with, and maybe some of them at high levels, some of them in low levels, some of them, maybe even more contextually based. But they're not like starting at zero, on any of this stuff. And to Kai's point, some of these things might have emerged in all kinds of contexts way outside of, say, formal academic structures, or, they might be life circumstance structures. They might be community organizations. And so, in our work, and I would encourage just generally, it's just a reminder that, people, whoever you're working with, students, members of an organization, come with some of these experiences. And as we learn from other kind of learning theories, certainly Marcia Baxter Magolda and others, is that like, it's on us as the educator, or if we're thinking in a context of leadership, it's on us as the leader to value and recognize those experiences, not to diminish and detract those experiences, because that's how we're going to get the most out of our team, out of our students, out of our leadership.
That's great.
So I think this is toward the end here. But I did try to anticipate some of this kind of extending this line of thinking out from college students and research here into a wider variety of contexts. I think that can be done. I mean, like when I read about things that go on way outside of college, they use very similar words and themes and ideas. So it gives me sense that there's some external validation on some of this. But, one thing to think about is like, where is our team with respect to that process component of innovation, right? I think oftentimes for very real reasons, sales imperatives and other things, performance imperatives, we can think a lot about the outcome, right? And I think what my research, hopefully, and others are talking about too, encourages us to think about innovation with respect to that process side. Where are we going? Where are we at with that?
Just to underscore that, we have Dr. Bob Colvord in the speaker series, who's the Chief Innovation Officer for the James Madison University, but also the Dean of the College of Integrated Science and Engineering. He emphasizes this. We have Debbie Irwin, who's the Executive Director of the Shenandoah Community Capital Fund that's trying to create a regional entrepreneurial or innovative ecosystem. She's talking about processes. We've got Dr. Gleb Siporsky. He has a specific process that he focuses on called asynchronous brainstorming, which is, a very tactical piece. And we have Jason Tanner, the CEO of Applied Frameworks, who talks about Scrum and product ownership and actual agile project management practices. All of them and others focus on process, and being explicit about what the norms are, not only in, broad everyday context, but when we're transitioning through change, for example, into hybrid and remote work organization. There's others I haven't mentioned that also focus on process.
Yeah, and I'll just want to emphasize something there. This idea of being explicit with process is key. Even if the process, right, is like a Scrum approach, which is about as like, it's directly tied into this kind of ideas. And watch that, because anyone that can speak about that in like ways that help you move forward with the concept, I'm not going to even try to, because it's complicated for me to do it quick, but really valuable stuff. But yeah, process not as this open-ended, multifaceted, takes forever thing, but really, processes and ways of moving forward toward outcomes, right? And the more you can kind of say, the better we can engage these processes, the better we can achieve these outcomes and demonstrate that, right? That's just going to be a win-win kind of for everybody. The second thing is thinking to kind of what Kai brought up before, like what capacities am I bringing to the table as a leader or a follower, or depending on various roles? What are the capacities of the team if you're leading a team? And this important point that we brought up before, but I want to emphasize again, like what capacities might we need to develop, right? If you kind of take this developmental approach as I do, as I think this whole series kind of does, right? If you kind of endeavor this from a developmental lens, then it becomes less of a fixed mindset of like, well, what do we have here and how's it going to go, toward like a growth mindset? Like, what can we do to kind of move this forward? And maybe there are ways, big and small. I mean, people think about, some of these trainings is they need to be 12 weeks and cost thousands of dollars, and there's huge value in that. Some of them are just giving people a different look, a different exercise, a different way of doing something that day, to kind of see what it might spark and might unlock kind of from an innovation standpoint.
Yeah, 100%. These are great framing questions. Thanks. They're just teeing me up to connect to some others. I mean, one, we have a 4-month-long innovative leadership program partnered with the Innovative Leadership Institute and Maureen Metcalf, who's the first speaker in the series, that talks about, in order to be innovative as a leader, we need to innovate our own leadership. We literally need to iterate and self-reflect and improve our own leadership ability. And, that changes based what we need to be doing as leaders changes as we progress in our career, as our team members change, as our challenges change, as how we do our work changes, as technology changes. So the idea that, you figured the leadership thing out isn't really the right way or the most useful way to be thinking about it. So we have the Innovative Leadership Program where she does some self-assessments and those sorts of things. We also have, as an example of this question being applied in a corporate setting, Steve Woodward, who's the Vice President for Quality, Talent, and Development at Red Roof. Red Roof, the hotel chain, multinational hotel chain. And he talked about that corporate office leadership team needing to reflect explicitly on these questions and do this not only as individuals, but at a team level to benefit their corporate office and then by extension, all their franchise organizations. So, great questions.
Yeah, and I'll just tuck that in the third one, how am I leading versus managing in these spaces, which I'm sure is covered better elsewhere. But part of that leadership, as you just kind of talked about there, is, one thing we talked about just in class, like a couple of weeks ago, because I was struggling a little bit with like a crisis leadership framework. And I put it to the students, I was like, help me better understand this thing. I tend to be very, if I don't understand something, let's try to understand it together, right? And Kai's been in class with me. That's kind of how I operate. But one thing we talked about was that leadership, and I think this is exactly what you just described, leadership can really be creating space for that reflection, right? Leadership can be saying, you know what, today, what we're going to do is really think back on what we've done, be here now, and kind of think toward where we're going as an individual, as a group, right? Management as a concept isn't capable of doing that. You can't manage reflection, right? I mean, I guess you can, but it's not going to be the depth, and certainly you're not going to get the most out of it. But yeah, creating and carving out space and time and prioritizing reflection is something as a class we kind of decided was an important part of leadership through crises. But also certainly to what you're saying and what the theme of the series is, leading through any kind of transition. So, if you were in charge of a in-person full team and now you're kind of a hybrid remote team, leading in that space might be having a moment, if you have, or continually having moments of, what have we learned? What's working? What's not working? And then once we've done that, okay, why is it working? Why is it not working? What can be done? How can we take advantage of these things? And I will add, just kind of based on that class conversation, what did we gain here by doing something in a more hybrid remote as a function of circumstance? What did we lose, right? Are there ways to kind of recreate? Because it can't be all positive all the time, right? There are things that have changed. There's different ways of working. And I think as a, whatever industry you're in, that's still being navigated. So I think a huge part of leadership, and I reference my class because they helped me really articulate this better than I would have even a couple of weeks ago. I think a big part of leadership in this transition space with kind of newer ways of working that involve much more hybrid and remote than we ever have, or we ever maybe even thought was feasible, is creating that space for reflection, for listening to what Kai is interested in, and for really bringing teams together to be vulnerable. I mean, that's an important part of any kind of creative process.
Well, I will pick up on you saying that other speakers having made the distinction with leaders and managing, or managers and leaders, and we haven't actually talked about that much, and we haven't talked about the study of leadership. So I would like to transition into our shameless plug and start by plugging the School of Strategic Leadership Studies. Particularly, we are doing a BA Strategic Leadership PhD student for a week. So the end of October 2022, you can sign up, and on the afternoons in that last week of the month, you'll be able to spend time with the director of the program, Dr. Margaret Sloan, if you're interested in pursuing a PhD. If maybe you've never thought about that before, maybe you don't know what that means, behavioral science, maybe you don't know what leadership studies is. So I'll just throw that out to Dr. Selznick, who's one of the faculty in the program. What would you say is studying leadership?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm currently teaching our kind of the first course anyone takes in our program is called Introduction to Leadership Studies and Ethics. And I think an important part is to understand that, I guess, a couple of things. The first is that leadership studies is a field of study, right? So there's a big conference we're all going to in a couple of weeks where it's just people who study leadership in a wide variety of academic ways, professional ways, kind of across that spectrum. But that leadership is a field of studies, and there's theories, some of them of which I mentioned in my talk. There's research designs. There's ways of studying leadership antecedents of leadership. There's ways of studying leadership's effect on other things. There's ways of studying leadership development. There's all kinds of permutations. There's journals. So, leadership as a field of studies with its own theories, with its own ways of conducting social scientific research to really understand it. And then the second part I would say is that we also, in our program and many other places, right, leadership is certainly an applied area. There's certainly theories and studies, but leadership is applied. And so we think about its application across a large number of areas. So our expertise in our school really focuses on organizational science, kind of other for-profit kind of sector leadership, nonprofit community volunteer leadership. And my background, given some of the talk, is on kind of leadership in post-secondary education organizations. And so we do think about it kind of in applied ways. And so it's that combination kind of leadership studies, leadership research designs that help us better understand leadership, as well as kind of its application across a number of different areas, that kind of brings us together as a school, and also kind of brings together individuals with a wide variety of kind of backgrounds and experiences who are all interested in studying various aspects and contexts of leadership.
If you are interested and have ever thought about getting a PhD, sign up for that BA Strategic Leadership PhD student for a week, and you will get all your questions answered, hopefully, about, is this something that interests you? And is it something that you might want to invest in yourself? And with that, let's switch to our listener thank you gift. What do you have for us?
Yeah, so in addition to hopefully giving some more information about the program, oh, thanks so much. Yeah, so this is a recent study that came out that uses, we actually in the research found ways to, through survey research, measure all of those different constructs, all those different capacities, and then we kind of roll them up to be kind of a single innovation capacity score. And in this research, we kind of did this over a four college years, so actually beginning of college, end of the first year, and end of the final year. We think it's a great paper. It's an interesting paper. You can see some of my co-authors on it as well. But the nice part about this paper is that it is open access. So you can just kind of click on it and read it and learn more. And it does have links to kind of some of our other papers and kind of other papers and research on this topic. So I hope, having that available gives folks kind of a deeper sense of, further kind of fleshes out some of my talk today and our conversation today, as well as kind of gives folks a deeper sense of some of the research that I do and how we kind of talked about and thought about operationalizing those capacities and our definition of innovation in a research setting among college students.
It's great that it's publicly accessible, and I really appreciate your time. We packed a lot into this interview. Anybody that sat through all of it is obviously really interested in this, and also I think hopefully feels their time was well spent. So really appreciate it. Any closing words as we conclude the interview?
Yeah, I guess to think about this and to kind of plug Kai's own work, leadership and this kind of question of innovation in hybrid and remote teams, this is a multifaceted, multi-perspective, transdisciplinary type of question and topic. So I would just encourage folks to kind of look at other series in the video, follow the links, read the things, because there's the things that I found about studying leadership, whether among college students or generally, is having a wide variety of perspectives is ultimately really helpful. Like I said, in the class the other day, we had everybody talking about this concept, and it really helped me better understand leadership in kind of a crisis situation, for example. So take advantage of kind of multiple perspectives on these questions. Where they agree, that's interesting. Where they disagree, that's also interesting. So yeah, I would just encourage folks to take full advantage of the speaker series and really kind of see this topic from a variety of perspectives.
Well, thanks again for your time, and thank you for watching or listening. Feel free to share this, subscribe to the YouTube channel, make sure that you sign up for the rest of the speaker series if you haven't.
Thank you.